Work and boredom have traditionally been synonymous in my world. I mean, to work is to endure boredom, but does it have to be this way? It's such a constant part of our lives that we don't really question it anymore. Does work have to be boring? Do we have to be bored when we work? As I'm making this video, the answer obviously is no, and that's because I've learned a way to pretty much eliminate boredom from work completely, to the point where boredom becomes a choice. Before I start working these days, I ask myself, just how bored do I want to be right now? And I can just adjust the level of boredom that I want to experience as I see fit to whatever level that I feel like on that given day. And I didn't just solve this boredom problem through some sort of superficial solution that makes boring work more interesting. Rather, I achieved this through a counterintuitive understanding of speed. And that's what I want to dive into in this video. I mean, speed is usually an objective measurement. You can measure how fast something is moving relative to a reference point. But what matters about speed, at least in the context of working, is completely subjective. That is, it doesn't matter how fast something is actually moving. What matters is how fast it feels to us. For instance, a plane can be moving at 600 miles an hour. That's quite fast, but if we're on that plane in the middle of an 8-hour flight, that's gonna feel quite slow to us. We're gonna be very bored. Whereas if we're on a 5-minute Uber ride from point A to point B, we get into the Uber, we get out after 5 minutes, that whole trip felt quite fast, even though we might have just been moving at 30 miles an hour. So all that is to say that how fast something is doesn't matter. What matters is how fast it makes us feel. And in the context of work, when work feels fast, we're not bored. We're very engaged. We are pretty much in a flow state. When work feels slow, we are bored. We're disengaged, we are looking at our watches and exerting willpower to force us to keep working. And with regard to speed, it doesn't matter how fast we're actually working. What matters in this context is how fast the work feels to us. And we've just established that the objective speed doesn't matter. What matters is your subjective feeling. But if the objective speed doesn't matter when it comes to our subjective feelings, what does? What is influencing our perception of the speed? The key variable here is something called time to completion. That is how long it takes from the start of a project to its end. When time to completion is short, that feels fast. If we get into a slowly moving car for a 5-minute car ride, the time to completion is 5 minutes. The objective speed is 30 miles an hour, but the fact that it's completed in 5 minutes makes the trip feels fast. Whereas that 8-hour plane ride feels slow because the time to completion is much longer. It's 8 hours. And it's good news for us because we have pretty much complete control over time to completion in pretty much all projects, because we have complete control over how we divide up a big task into smaller tasks. If we have a big project that has a long time to completion, simply by dividing it into smaller subtasks, each subtask would have a shorter time to completion. And the more subtasks we create, the faster the time to completion. And whenever we complete something, our brain registers the completion of that task and gives us some dopamine. And it's always crazy to me to see people try to tackle a very big project without cutting it up into smaller tasks at all. They just want to brute force through this entire long, big project with no mini completions in between. So what they're essentially doing is they're trying to complete this whole thing in one go with no intermittent dopamine release. And it takes a very interesting kind of person to be able to do that, to have the monstrous level of willpower to persevere through 0 feedback loops in the entire duration of this project, just force himself through this whole thing with no rewards of dopamine until the very end. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but the likelihood of success for most people is low in that case. And when you do divide the big task into smaller tasks, what you're doing is you're giving yourself opportunities to be rewarded while going from the beginning of a project to the end. And the more subtasks you have, the more of these reward points there will be during the project. And the more subtasks you have, the shorter the time to completion of each subtask will be, and the faster work will feel to us, because our brain is waiting for reward basically as we work. And if you get rewarded every 2 minutes of dopamine, that's a much shorter time to completion, which makes the whole project feels fast. But this isn't to say that the more subtasks there are, the better, because you could imagine a scenario where at some point as you're dividing up more and more subtasks, there will be too many subtasks in some scenarios so as to be impractical and not easy to manage. You could have a bunch of mini tasks that are so small that you get them done every 30 seconds. So the majority of your capacity is now spent on managing these subtasks instead of doing the actual work. There is a happy medium here where you have enough subtasks with short enough time to completion so as to make the work feels fast and make yourself engaged and in flow, but not too many subtasks to the point where task management becomes impractical. So a good example is reading a book, right? If you have a project which is to read a very big, thick, boring textbook, the brute force approach would be to just have no subtasks whatsoever and just to force yourself to read through the entire book in one go. The time to completion is that of the entire project of finishing the entire book, and that's time to completion is long. Reading through that book will feel quite slow and quite boring. So you could imagine how one can easily cut that big project into smaller tasks. We can say, I'm just going to read one chapter at a time. I'm going to define the completion of each chapter as a subtask. Now, suddenly the work feels much faster. So the time it takes to read a chapter is much shorter than that of the entire book. So as you're reading through this whole book, you're getting dopamine hit at the end of each chapter. The objective speed with which you read the book is still the same, but the work suddenly feels faster and you suddenly can become more engaged and the work becomes less boring, but each chapter could still be too big. You could have very long chapters. You could still feel slow, faster than reading the whole book, but still too slow for some people. So you could divide it up further. Say, I'm going to define reading each page as a subtask. Now you can see how the work will become much faster in this case. You could even further divide it into defining reading each paragraph as a subtask, which can be even more helpful. But as you go even further, like defining reading each sentence as a subtask or even each word as a subtask, now you've arrived into the territory where there are too many subtasks to be manageable. All your effort will just be spent on managing the subtask and tracking the completion of each subtask than doing the actual work. Now, it's easy to see that all this is specific to the individual. Each person will have their own optimal range of threshold of what level of granularity of subtask division is optimal. So it really depends on the individual for which level of subdivision is optimal. So naturally, I encourage you to play around with this, to start dividing up your projects into smaller tasks and see how you feel about it. Right, you'll feel an increasing speed and an increased level of engagement, and that might encourage you to further divide up the task. But at some point, you find that you're spending too much time managing these division of subtasks rather than doing the actual work. So you might want to dial it down a little bit. Just shift between these different ranges until you find a range that works for you specifically. Now, before I end this video, I just want to play devil's advocate in my own video and just say that it's not always a bad thing to be bored. I mean, boredom is not always a signal that something needs to change. It often is a signal that something needs to change. Like if you're just routinely bored with your work, maybe you don't like your work that much. Maybe you need to start strategizing about changing career paths to find something that you're more passionate about doing. That's true, but that's not always true. There are scenarios where boredom is actually good. For instance, it could just be someone very capable of solving the types of problems that you solve in your industry. You could just be so skilled at what you do that what most people find incredibly difficult to solve, you find it incredibly easy to solve. Curing cancer over here and solving world hunger over there and just creating all these values in society, but you're just so good at what you do that it's just not that challenging for you and it feels boring to you. And at that point, it might be wise to keep doing what you're doing despite the fact that you're bored, because your boredom is more a signal for the fact that you've reached competence, not that the work itself is not something you're meant to be doing. You could just keep doing what you're doing and just do more reps of it and make millions of dollars doing it, and just do it for a few more years and make the rest of the world happy while making millions of dollars. Nothing wrong with that. Another example could be you're in a very healthy relationship with your partner, and because the relationship is truly healthy, it doesn't have drama. It's just a very peaceful relationship, and you might get bored in that relationship thinking something is wrong in that relationship, not knowing that you're in fact in a place where where most couples are envious of. And it's easy to see how boredom in this case also isn't a signal that something needs to change. Nothing really needs to change in this case because nothing is wrong. You might just need to be more cognizant of where you are and how lucky you are, and be more appreciative of the little things in the relationships and your partner and your good fortune. So boredom isn't always bad. But when it comes to work, if you're routinely bored, now that you've understood speed, you no longer need to be bored.